Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, today is April 11th? I know it's sometime in April. April 11th, 2015. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, today we will be taking in the Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 129. This is called the Bala Pandita Sutta, the discourse on the fools and the wise men. And this sutta is a bit different from many of the other suttas that we've covered so far, since many of the suttas that we've been examining deal with, you might call it, the path to liberation. And they deal with different philosophical topics, methods of meditation, methods of personal training. But this, we have to remember that the path to liberation takes place in the original context of the Buddha's teaching. It takes place against the larger background to the Buddha Dharma, which is the process of samsara, that is the process of repeated existence within the round of rebirths. And the Buddha, as a fully enlightened spiritual teacher, doesn't teach only the path to liberation, but it's said, for example, in Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 12, one of the attributes of the Buddha, his powers of knowledge, is the knowledge of the paths leading to all destinations. And so the Buddha knows not only the way to final liberation, but he knows the paths that lead to lower types of rebirth, rebirth into the hell realm, the animal realm, the realm of the pretas or afflicted spirits. He knows the path to the human rebirth and the path to a heavenly or celestial rebirth. And so part of the Buddha's mission as a spiritual teacher, he's not only teaching people who have little dust in their eyes, who are ready for liberation, but he's also teaching great numbers of ordinary people who still have far to go in their migration through samsara. And so he has to teach them how to avoid the fall into lower types of rebirth, and how to practice in ways that will help them achieve higher types of rebirth. And he also has to point out, in order to motivate people to avoid the types of conduct that lead to lower rebirths, he has to point out the dangers and the misery in the lower types of rebirth. And also, in order to motivate people to practice virtuous types of deeds that will lead to a higher rebirth, he has to point out the blessings and benefits of rebirth in the higher realms. And in going about this task, the Buddha sometimes compares himself to a horse trainer. Like the horse trainer uses two types of methods to train the horse. Maybe in American idiom we would use the expression, he uses the stick and the carrot. That is, to get the horse to perform certain tricks. Sometimes he'll have to hit the horse with the whip. And at other times, or with other types of horses, he'll reward them with extra carrots or whatever food they like to eat. Chocolates and ice cream. And so the Buddha uses similar types of techniques, sometimes in order to get people to avoid bad, unwholesome conduct. He'll point out the misery and suffering and terrors of the lower realms, particularly of rebirth in the hell realm. And then to motivate people to do the good, he'll point out and describe the bliss and the pleasure and the glory of rebirth in the heavenly realms. Of course, for the Buddha, rebirth in heaven is not the final goal of his teaching. It's just call it a halfway house, a stepping stone, a sort of temporary respite from the miseries of rebirth in the lower realms. But it's possible from the heavenly realms to gain the paths and fruits and even to reach final liberation in the heavenly realms. It's sometimes said that the Buddha says that the human realm is the best of all realms. I don't think that's completely true according to the early teachings. What is said is that it's in the human realm that a Buddha arises, because it's in the human realm that there is the right combination of suffering and happiness, of transience and some stability. And so a Buddha who has to discover the path for himself always arises in the human realm. And maybe for many beings, human existence provides that right combination of suffering and ease to motivate them to enter the path. But once one gains a right view, a right understanding, the heavenly realms provide much more suitable and congenial conditions for making further progress on the path. And so the Buddha doesn't tell people to avoid a heavenly rebirth and try to come back to the human realm, but he tells them to aspire for rebirth in the good destinations. And the good destinations include the human realm and the heavenly realms. What is to be avoided, according to the Buddha's teaching, is rebirth in the formless realms. Because in the formless realms, one doesn't have any opportunity to hear the Dhamma, because one doesn't have a bodily form, and so one doesn't have ears with which one could hear the Dhamma being taught. But the beings in the other heavenly realms do have ears, do have physical bodies, and so they can, in their mode of existence, they can hear the Dhamma even from the Buddha. They can witness the Buddha teaching the Dhamma in the human realm, and they could participate in the assemblies, the Dharma assemblies. Though we don't see them, but they will be present, it said, invisible to us, but they can perceive the Buddha and the human beings. And so they can witness the Dhamma being taught in the human realm by the Buddha. And so the Buddha, in a general way, he divides the different realms within samsara into two broad levels. So we have two broad levels. One is called, can you see? One is called Dugati, which means, Gati means the destination. In other words, it means a realm of rebirth. And the prefix dur means bad. So these are the bad destinations. And there are said to be three bad destinations. The hell realms, of which there are there are many. The animal realm, and then there are the pretas, which is translated into Chinese as Wei, which means hungry ghosts or hungry spirits. But they're not only afflicted by hunger, but sometimes by extreme thirst, other types of misery. So I render the expression as the afflicted spirits. Okay, then there's a kind of dividing line, a boundary, and then above that boundary we have what is called Sugati, which are the good destinations, the good, desirable realms of rebirth. And that is the human realm, which again, there are many different gradations within the human realm. Then there are the 6 sense sphere heavens, in which the beings still have full sense faculties and enjoy sensual pleasures, but the pleasures are much more refined than in the human realm, and the joy and happiness, it's much more intense than in the human realm. Then above the sense sphere heavens, we have the form realm, inhabited by divine beings of great power and majesty, and whose main type of experience is deep meditative bliss. And then above the form realm, there is the formless realm, in which all bodily form, all material form has dropped away, and the beings exist there just as consciousness, as mind. Existence in those realms is said to be very peaceful, very equanimous. But there's no capacity in that realm, as I said earlier, for hearing the Dhamma. And so if one is reborn there through the power of samadhi, very deep meditative absorption, one could pass aeons in deep serenity, tranquility, imperturbable equanimity, but there's no opportunity to develop insight wisdom there, the wisdom that leads to liberation. Okay, so coming back from this elegant and complicated cosmology to the sutta. Okay, here the Buddha is going to speak about the contrast between foolish people and wise people. And he's going especially to elaborate the type of rebirth that awaits each type, each kind of person. So he begins by saying that there are three characteristics of a fool, signs of a fool, attributes of a fool. The word for fool is bala, which sometimes is used to mean a child. I think in singular it's used to mean a child, is that correct? Bala? You're Sinhalese? Okay. Yeah, but originally the sense is that of a fool. And the Buddha says that there are three ways that one could understand who is a fool. That is, by way of their thinking, their speech, and their bodily actions. So the fool is one who thinks bad thoughts, speaks bad words, and does bad deeds. And this sutta doesn't fully explicate what is meant by bad deeds, bad words, bad thoughts, but other suttas, see, the Buddha's teaching is always very systematic, and usually to make it easy to remember, the Buddha lays down different aspects of the teaching in numerical schemes. And so you don't have to struggle to look in this sutta, that sutta, but when you know the numerical scheme, then you can fill in what is intended. So what is the numerical scheme that encapsulates bad deeds, bad speech, bad thoughts? Anybody know what it is? We've come across it many times. No.
10 unwholesome deeds.
Right, exactly. It's called the 10 unwholesome deeds, or the 10 pathways of unwholesome deeds. So bad bodily actions, killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. Bad verbal deeds, lying, slanderous speech, or sometimes called divisive speech, harsh speech, idle chatter or gossip. Then bad thoughts would be thoughts which are governed by covetousness, that is, desiring to get the possessions of others, anger, ill will, wishing harm to others, and wrong views. Okay, so the fool is one who is characterized briefly by bad thoughts, bad words, bad deeds. In more detail, one who engages repeatedly in the 10 courses of unwholesome action. Okay, now the Buddha is going to explain the dangers or the disadvantages in being a fool. That is, in engaging in these types of unwholesome thoughts, words, and deeds. And he's going to do this by dividing the dangers or disadvantages into 2 broad categories. One are the dangers visible right here and now in this life, and then the dangers that lie ahead in the future life. And he's going to explain 3 types of dangers right here and now. So he says, a fool feels pain and grief here and now in 3 ways. The first, we might say briefly, is acquiring a bad reputation. And this is rather stated a bit indirectly here. So that's when a fool is seated, it might be indirectly, but I know it's a situation I'm quite familiar with myself. A fool is seated in an assembly or along a street or in a square, and people are discussing certain pertinent and relevant matters. So if the fool is one who kills, who takes life, takes what is not given, misbehaves in sensual pleasures, speaks falsehood, and engages in liquor and intoxicants, then he thinks, these people are speaking about these matters, and I am one who engages in these things. And so when people are criticizing one who takes life, who steals, and so on, then the fool applies that to himself and thinks, if people knew what I am doing, then they would all sort of gang up on me and blame me and criticize me and reproach me for what I'm doing. And in fact, it often happens that the fool is one who gets caught. When especially powerful people in positions of we have some of these cases of prominent politicians. I remember there was a governor or representative from South Carolina who claimed that some years ago that he was going someplace on a health resort to restore. He was hiking the Appalachian Trail, but then somehow they discovered that he was going off, was it to South America, to have an affair with his mistress, and he was a married man. And then all of this got blown up in the news, and he had to resign from his office.
Will actually be able to think and look at himself in such a discerning manner as to say, well, these things are found in me? If you're engaging in these, obviously you have wrong views, so it would require a bit of insight.
Well, I think the fool would know that he's engaging in these things, and so when people are speaking critically about them, in his own mind he would know that he's one who engages in these things, but he wouldn't be willing to open himself up and to admit to others that he engages in them. Okay, and then we have many prominent politicians who are getting, kickbacks from companies that they lobby for or that they support with their votes. And so this is, I guess it's illegal to get kickbacks in this way, to accept bribes, which is a form of taking what is not given. And then every once in a while, usually when there are committees to criticize bribery, these are the guys who get on the committees and are the most vocal critics. We have to have laws against this, we need stricter regulations. But then when the company comes and says, will you support our policy? And here we give you, if you check your bank account, you'll find a deposit of $10,000 has just been entered there. Okay, so when the fool hears those who engage in these things being criticized, well, I think most fools would not be so sensitive about that. They wouldn't really care. But there might be some who have a sense of conscience, and when they hear this, then they feel guilty about it. So that's one kind of pain and grief that the fool feels here and now. Okay, a second one, when a robber culprit is caught, a fool sees the kings having many kinds of torture inflicted on him. Like in those days, one didn't simply get a prison sentence and get, 10 years, 20 years in prison, where you're living in fairly, I don't want to endorse the American prison system in any way, but one is still getting 3 meals a day, living in fairly comfortable conditions. You get at least an hour of exercise a day. If you get ill, they'll bring in a doctor to check one and prescribe medication. But in ancient India, it was not like that at all. But if you're arrested by the king, you get flogged with whips, beaten with canes, beaten with clubs. You could have your hands cut off, feet cut off, ears cut off, nose cut off, and subjected to a number of tortures which are not explained here. The commentary explains them. I want to spare the more sensitive members of the class by withholding detailed explanations. They call them the porridge pot, the polished cell-shave, Rahu's mouth, the fiery wreath, the flaming hand, and so on. One has them splashed with boiling oil, thrown to the dogs, impaled on stakes, and have their heads cut off with a sword. Okay, so then when the fool hears about these torments and he realizes these things that he himself engages in the same type of actions, then he will feel, I would say, not pain and grief, but fear and terror of being caught. So this would be the second type of, what's called the second type of pain and grief. And then what happens, of course, if one is caught and then subjected to these tortures, that's even more severe misery in this life. Okay, then comes the third danger or misery. That is when the fool is this would be the kind of misery of a heavy conscience. So when the fool is on his chair or on his bed or resting on the ground, and there's nothing else to distract him, then sometimes the thoughts of his unwholesome deeds come and they cover up his mind, they spread over him and envelop him, just like the shadow of a mountain. And I think this is, though it doesn't say so explicitly here, but this is indicating what happens to the fool when he's on the verge of death. You know, when he's in his final days, when he's not able to distract himself by indulging in sensual pleasures, but now he's incapacitated. And so there comes a kind of replay in the mind of everything one has done in one's past in this life. It all gets played back before the mind. And so he's now recollecting his misconduct of body, speech, and mind, and it's all starting to weigh heavily on him. And so he thinks, in this life, I have not done what is good. I have not done what is wholesome. I have not made for myself a shelter from anguish, but I have done what is evil, cruel, and wicked. And then he starts thinking of what destination lies ahead for him. And he realizes that I shall go to the destination of those who have done what is bad. And so then he starts sorrowing, weeping and lamenting, beating his breast. Okay, so that is the third type of misery relating to this life itself. But then, now we come to the other type of misery. This is the misery pertaining to the future life. And so it said that the fool who is engaged in misconduct of body, speech, and mind on the dissolution of the body after death reappears in a state of deprivation, that is, in one of the bad destinations, even in hell. And now the Buddha is going to go into a somewhat detailed description of the bad destinations, at least of hell and the animal realm. Okay, so the Buddha begins, he sort of opens up the topic by saying that this is utterly undesirable, utterly miserable, utterly disagreeable. That is the suffering of hell. And when the Buddha says this, then a monk asks the Buddha, is it possible to give a simile for the suffering of hell? And then the Buddha gives a rather impressive or even terrifying simile. He says, suppose there's a man who has been caught, a robber who has been caught by the police, by the king's men, and they present him to the king, saying that this man is a robber. Order whatever punishment you will for him. And notice that he doesn't get a fair trial, but just by the report of the king's men, the king on his own, he's entitled to inflict the punishment. So he says, go and strike this man in the morning with 100 spears. And so in the morning, they strike him with 100 spears. Excuse me. I have a nasty sense of humor. a sadistic sense of humor.
Did you go through this when you were doing the translations?
This laughter? I don't think so. Okay, then at noon, the king asks his men, how is that man? Is he still alive? How is that man doing? Like as if there would be any doubt. He's been hit by 100 spears. How could he be alive? But somehow, by a miracle, the men say, he's still alive. So the king says, then get some medical attendants to look after him and bring him back to health. No, that's not what the sutta says. According to the sutta, the king says, go and strike that man with another 100 spears. Please, a little compassion, sir. Okay, so the men hit him with another 100 spears. Then in the evening, the king says, how's that man doing? Oh, he's in wonderful condition. He's been playing out in the yard. He's joined the soccer team. No, they say, he's still alive, sir. So the king says, well, we really have to look after him, give him nourishing food, get a doctor for him, treat his wounds. But no, the king says, it's evening, go and strike that man again with 100 spears. And so in the evening, they strike him with 100 spears. So then the Buddha says, what do you think? Wouldn't that man experience great misery and grief because of being struck with 300 spears? And so the monk says, surely that man would experience pain and grief even if he were hit by 1 spear, which is certainly enough, let alone 300. 100 in the morning, 100 in noon, 100 in the evening. Okay, then the Buddha takes a small stone up in his hand and he says, what do you think? Which is greater, this small stone that I'm holding in my hand or the Himalayan mountains? And of course the monk says that the small stone in the Buddha's hand is very small. It's nothing compared to the Himalayan mountains. And so then the Buddha says that this pain and grief, the misery and pain and the torment that man experienced by being struck with 300 spears is nothing compared to the suffering of hell. It's not even a fraction. There is no comparison. The other day after I was reviewing this sutta, in the evening I have to take this, it's an extraction, it's from cayenne pepper. It's a tincture, yes, a tincture. And so usually I take 20 drops of it and I mix it in water and put in some of the sour apple cider. And then every evening I drink it and I can take it. It's a bit hot because of the cayenne, but when it's diluted with enough water, then it's tolerable. It's a little burning sensation in the mouth, but it's tolerable. But the other day, I must have forgotten to put in sufficient water. But I put in the cayenne, the drops of cayenne, 20 drops. Then I took it full shot in my mouth, the way I usually do. And it was just burning so hot that I just ran to the bathroom and spit it out and drank cup after cup of water, and it took about 15 minutes before the burning sensation subsided. And then I was thinking, on the basis of the sutta, if this is just like a pebble compared to the suffering of hell, I can't imagine what the suffering of hell is like. If anybody wants to try taking 20 drops of cayenne pepper in just a tiny bit of water, I'll invite you to try it. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to explain in detail the suffering of hell. And so I think you can read this on your own. I don't have to go into the detail. But he begins by explaining this seems to be the suffering that one undergoes at the entrance to the hell. That the wardens of hell give him what's called the fivefold transfixing. That is, they drive a red-hot iron stake through each hand, that's 2, through each foot, that's 4, and then they drive the other stake through the breast. And so now he feels extremely excruciating, agonizing pain, but this is the key for the suffering of hell. He does not die so long as that evil karma that brought him there is not exhausted. Okay, then the text describes other types of suffering or torture that he undergoes in hell. And all of this seems to be the part of the preliminary torture, because it's finally, as paragraph 16, that the wardens of hell throw him into what is called the great hell, the Majjhima. And this is described as having 4 corners with 4 doors, one on each side. It's walled up with iron and shut in with an iron roof. Its floor as well is made of iron and heated till it glows with fire. The range is a full 100 leagues, which it covers all pervasively. And if you want to read a detail, if this isn't enough for you, if you want to read a detailed description of the suffering in the great hell, then you can go on to the next sutta, sutta number 130, called the Divine Messengers, which also is paragraph 16 there. It has this same statement about the great hell, but then it goes on into a detailed description of the misery, the torment of the great hell. But here the Buddha just cuts it short and says that he could go on and explain at length the suffering in hell. But now the Buddha passes to describe the suffering in the animal realm. This is another one of the types of existence in the bad destinations. So he speaks about animals that feed on grass. And so a fool that here delighted in tastes and did evil actions, then might be reborn amongst the animals that feed on grass, like horses, cattle, donkeys, goats, and deer. But then there are animals that feed on dung. For example, certain types of poultry, pigs, dogs, and jackals. And here the Buddha almost mockingly compares these type of animals to the Brahmins, who when they smell a sacrifice go running to the sacrifice thinking, we can eat here, we can eat here. And so there are other animals, there are animals who when they smell dung, they go running to the dung thinking, there's a meal for us, here there's a meal for us. And so the fool who formerly delighted in taste and did bad deeds can be reborn in the company of the animals that feed on dung. Then there are animals that are born, grow old, and die in darkness, like moths, maggots, earthworms, and other such animals. Okay, so that's a possible realm of rebirth for fools. Then there are animals that are born, age, and die in water, like fish, turtles, and crocodiles. And so that's another realm of rebirth for the fool. Then there are animals that are born, age, and die. Here it's called filth, but I think it actually means in the carcasses of other animals. Because the example is given of animals that are born, age, and die in a rotten fish or a rotten corpse, in rotten porridge, in a cesspit or in a sewer. And so that's a possible realm of rebirth for fools who do evil deeds. And again, the Buddha says that he could speak at length about the misery of an animal rebirth, but this much is sufficient. Then he uses a simile